are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about the Starved Rock murders. Now, many go missing in state parks and are never found, but in this case, these women were actually only a mile from their lodge and were found murdered. However, this case has been solved, but many believe that the wrong person has been imprisoned for many years. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and so all I ask is for some support by subscribing and watching these videos because it would mean the world to me. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1960 in Illinois, and Starved Rock State Park is in Utica, Illinois. But it was March of 1960, and three women were planning a 4-day kind of little getaway trip, girls trip, for themselves. This was 50-year-old Mildred Lindquist, 50-year-old Lillian Oding, and 47-year-old Frances Murphy. They were all planning to get away for a little while. They all lived in the Chicago suburbs and had gone to the Presbyterian church where they actually came up with this plan. They were all wives of business executives and were pretty close friends, and decided that they were all going to go to this state park to have some fun. This place not only had a creepy name, it also had a very dark history. And back in the 1760s, the Illiniwek Indians were actually under attack by the Ottawa Potawatomi tribes, and they came to this location at Starved Rock and they got on a fortress. This rock fortress was about 130 feet above the Illinois River, and they had very little supplies when they started to camp out here to make sure that the Ottawa Potawatomi tribe left. However, they weren't leaving, and they kind of staked out down below, and this meant that the Illiniwek tribe had no supplies to survive with and were actually sending buckets down with vines. Like, they were attached to vines. They were lowering them down to the river to get some water to drink. However, the Ottawa Potawatomi tribes were cutting off the vines so the buckets would fall and they could get no water. And slowly the Illiniwek tribe would starve to death, and that is how this state park got its name. Now, Lillian thought that this was a much needed trip for all of them. She had actually spent the entire winter taking care of her husband, who had just had a heart attack, and they were just really wanting to get away for some girls' time, which is completely fine. And they had actually planned it down to the detail. They had gone out to grocery stores, bought a whole bunch of food for their families back at home so they couldn't say that they were hungry, that they went without food. So they had it all planned out, and they were going to head to the state park and do anything outdoors, bird watching, hiking, literally anything that they could do. So on Monday, March 14th, Frances was actually the one to drive them in her little gray station wagon, and she parked in the parking lot of this lodge that they were going to stay at the state park, and they got all their luggage, which they didn't have a lot, even though there was 3 of them. They really packed lightly, and they headed inside to check in. They actually got 2 rooms that were right next to each other, and they dropped their stuff off, and they decided to go out to get something to eat at the little diner that was in the lodge. These women all appeared to be genuinely happy souls that would talk to anybody, and they were all talking to the staff about how it was a beautiful day and that they were planning to go on a hike after they got done eating. Now, of course, with so many visitors coming in and out of the lodge, these staff members wouldn't really notice if anybody left and didn't come back, or really if they left at all, and they only knew this about these women because they had specifically talked to them and were very nice to them. Of course, you remember nice people, and so that's why they noticed that they were leaving. However, they didn't notice that they never came back. Now, George, who was Lillian's husband, the one who had the heart attack, called the lodge later that day because Lillian had promised that she would call him at the end of the evening once they got settled in, because Lillian was very paranoid leaving George alone after having this heart attack, that she said, look, to ease my paranoia, I'm going to call you just to have a chat so we both know that we're okay, and then we can have fun from there. And so George knew this, that Lillian was definitely going to call him. However, Lillian never did. So George called the lodge and said, can I talk to my wife? She was supposed to call and she never did. But the staff members said that they couldn't be reached, that the women were probably out and they hadn't returned yet, so he should probably just call in the morning. He of course didn't want to be overbearing, and he wanted Lillian to have a good time on this girls trip, and he thought maybe she just forgot. So he let it go and he decided he'd call the next morning. The next morning came, Lillian still hadn't called George, so he called the lodge again and said, "Can I please talk to my wife?" At this point they said, "Look, she's out once again. However, we saw them at breakfast this morning, so we know they're fine. She just probably has forgotten to call you, and maybe you should try again later." And George, hearing that they had seen his wife, felt a little better, even though he was kind of on edge at this point, and just let it be and let Lillian enjoy herself. However, the staff members had been mistaken and didn't see the women that day for breakfast at all. You see, the three women had left the previous day wearing rubber galoshes, like huge boots, to go out hiking because it was snowing outside. Now, they were carrying a camera and a small pair of binoculars. They planned to go to a nearby canyon that was the St. Louis Canyon, about a mile away from the actual lodge. However, to get there, like I said, it was March in the Midwest, and it can go either way. It can be sunshine, it can be snowing, and here at this time it was snowing briefly. There was some snow covering the ground. It didn't appear that the cold or the snow was stopping them. They actually took the camera out and were taking several pictures along their journey, smiling, having a good time, and capturing memories. But this path would lead them to basically a dead end that was the St. Louis Canyon. It was a rock formation that was kind of ending on all sides and had a waterfall in the middle. And of course, because it was snowing, this waterfall was frozen, but that actually made it even more beautiful, and many people want to see it when it's frozen as well. But when they got there, Lillian was actually the one holding the camera and taking several different photos of the scenery. But this innocent, beautiful hike would soon turn into a crime scene, and later the night that they went missing, there was actually a blizzard which had several inches of snow fall, covering not only the whole entire canyon, but also their bodies that had not yet been found because there was such bad weather and nobody wanted to chance it because they didn't think they really had to. There was no reason to. Nobody was alerted to the fact that these women were missing just yet. The lodge had, however, gotten a postcard for these three women, and it was from a friend of theirs who just wrote them saying, "I hope you're having a good time. Can't wait to see you once you get done to hear about your trip." And this was just something that was done back then because of course they couldn't just text you saying, "Hey, miss you, hope you're having a good time." So people would write postcards to each other, and this lady did. Of course, they were also older, so that you take that into account too. And this lodge got the postcard for the women, and next to the bedrooms there was actually like mailboxes, little boxes that you could put mail for your guests in, and the staff put the card in their mailboxes, not knowing that these women would never be able to receive it. On technically the third day that George would call the lodge, wondering where his wife was, their bodies would be found. It was first found actually by a reporter named Bill Dandy. He was one of them that found them first, and he got a tip about their disappearance and immediately headed there, meaning this was about to be a huge media case. But nonetheless, Mildred, Lillian, and Francis were all found on a ledge, and their bodies were half covered in snow, and their skirts were above their heads with their legs spread open. They had all been bludgeoned on the head severely. There was bruises all over their legs and blood everywhere. And Lillian and Francis were actually tied together with a twine, but Mildred was left on her own. They were found on their backs under a small ledge as though they had been drugged there. And this whole search for them actually started because when George called yet again and his wife still was not answering, George was like, "Okay, this is it. You are going to go search their bedrooms and you are going to find me some more information." So he demanded that the staff go into the bedrooms, which they did, and they found that their bags were in there, but they were not unpacked. The beds had not been unmade, and Lillian's gray station wagon was still parked in the parking lot where it had been. It didn't appear to even have been moved because of course the snow could kind of tell if it had been left, but it was just covered in snow. So these ladies could have been missing up to 40 hours now, and this is because nobody really even knew that they were missing. But Lillian's husband George was on top of it. As soon as he knew that something was wrong, he contacted a friend named Virgil Peterson, who was also the operating director of Chicago Crime Commission. Virgil started working right away to put together an investigation using the LaSalle County Sheriff's Office, and Sheriff Ray Iuzzi was one who was among those searching for these women. This crime scene was extremely hard to piece together, considering now there were 6 inches of snow covering anything that could have been there underneath it. They had no idea what they were coming up to or what to even look for, but it did show signs of a violent struggle. There was about 10 feet away from the bodies, their camera with the leather casing covered in blood, and the strap actually was snapped off. There was also a pair of bloody binoculars nearby that were thought to be theirs, and there was what was believed to be the murder weapon, which was a tree branch that was like 3 feet long, 4 inches thick, that was covered in blood, and this led to a path deeper in the canyon that was believed to be where they were actually murdered, and they had their bodies dragged to this ledge. Now, when these bodies were examined, the time of death was thought to be between 2 and 3, which was shortly after they actually left the lodge for the hike, and they were said to have been thought to be sexually assaulted. However, because it was so cold, they couldn't actually find out if that was true or not, and there was also that meant that there was no DNA or semen to be found. However, at that time they couldn't really have tested it anyway, so it didn't really help in this case. Now, the motive at first was thought, okay, maybe it was robbery. However, these women didn't have anything on them, and all of their belongings were back in the room, so they kind of ruled this out. However, there could have been someone who thought that they had something and were angry when they didn't. But because these murders were so incredibly brutal, the investigators immediately thought that this was some sort of sociopath who possibly even escaped from a mental institute. They actually used that when telling people what to look for. Now, of course, I said that this was huge media news because there was a reporter there that night who immediately ran back and spread the story everywhere. This meant not only was the public scared, but also they were demanding answers right away so they could feel a little more secure. But the problem was investigators from different departments were having a very hard time figuring out who this case belonged to, because of course LaSalle County wanted it because it was in their county, they were the ones who were called, but the state police also wanted it because it was in a state park. So instead of really working on this case, at first they were more just fighting over who should work on it, which of course made everything go slower. And that is when State Attorney Warren actually decided to take this investigation into his own hands. He wasn't a detective by any means, but he knew that he could get something done while everybody else was just fighting and arguing about what to do. And so he decided to look at the crime scene and think, is there anything that this killer possibly left behind? And there really wasn't very much evidence besides the fact that there was twine combining 2 of the women. That, of course, was not just on the women or in the area. This had come from something because, of course, the tree branch, the murder weapon, had come from nature. There was nothing you could really trace. However, this twine could be traced. And so Warren went out and bought a microscope with his own money, used this twine, looked underneath the microscope, and found that it was a 20-ply and a 12-ply. From there, he took 2 detectives who had a little more expertise in this area, and he went back to the lodge to see if this twine matched anything at the lodge. He had this theory that it could have been from there, and when he went there, within minutes, he found that that is the exact same twine that was used in the lodge's kitchen to wrap the food. And the manufacturer actually confirmed that it was the same type of twine from a bundle at this lodge's kitchen. And of course, this led everyone to believe this was someone who worked at the lodge. However, they had all been previously put under polygraph test and questioned, and everybody passed. But that wasn't going to stop Warren from getting more polygraph tests done on these employees. You see, there was actually a photograph of the women found that had a blurry figure of a man in the back that they couldn't see who it was, but they could see that right before their murder there was this blurry figure. And there was also the fact that there was this postcard that was given to the ladies that the staff knew they posted in their mailboxes, and yet it was now nowhere to be found. The day after the murders, a maid had actually gone into their bedrooms to do a little tidy up to clean their beds, but found that the beds were unmade. However, there was an imprint in the pillow. And in the shower, there were wet towels on the ground. There was a ring of grease in the shower, and it appeared as though someone had been there. There was also a bar of wet soap, and Lillian's room key had never been found. So these were all kind of pointing to someone had access to this lodge that knew how to sneak around throughout it, which of course would be easiest for an employee. So Warren got a cabin near this lodge, and he set up this new polygraph system. And he would bring everyone one by one in again to take these tests. Nearly a dozen more employees had come back in again and passed again, and they were about to give up when a man named Chester Otto Weger walked in. And he was a former dishwasher at the lodge. And as soon as he left the cabin after questioning, the examiner's face was completely pale, and he told Warren, "That's your man." Chester was a 20-year-old small man with a wife and 2 children who had just resigned that summer from the lodge to go into business with his father as a house painter. Now, he was also a boxer with a nickname of Rocky, and the day after the murders, he would go into work with his father, and the other employees would notice that he had scratches all over his face, which he said was because of shaving. And of course, they wanted to investigate Chester, and he was completely okay with that. He even gave them a buckskin jacket that had some strange dark stains on it that they just wanted to test, and that actually came back positive for human blood. There was actually a shed where Chester often went for work that was said to have twine in it that was like the one that the 2 women were bound with. And more polygraphs were given to Chester, and he failed all of them. Of course, the investigators started to look for past unsolved crimes in the area to see if Chester had done this before that had escalated into this gruesome murder of 3 women, and they actually found an unsolved rape and robbery from a year prior of a 17-year-old girl. And they went to this girl and they showed her a whole bunch of mugshots of different men, and she was flipping through them to see if she could identify her attacker. And when she got to Chester Weger, she stopped and she screamed. It was him. Now, the investigators went back to Chester's place, and they didn't tell him at first that they were arresting him. They were just actually asking him questions. But this interrogation lasted until midnight, and finally he just stopped mid-sentence and said, "Can I see my family?" And they brought his family in to see him, and then that is when an officer would turn to Chester and say, "Chester, why don't you tell me about it? There are just 2 of us here. Just tell me about it." And he did. He actually said, "All right, I did it. I got scared. I tried to grab their pocketbook. They fought, and I hit them." Now, it was theorized that Chester had thought that the camera that they had was actually a pocketbook, which was why the strap was broken, because he was trying to get it away from them and didn't know that it was actually a camera. And Chester was then asked, "Okay, why did you drag the bodies from where you murdered them to this ledge? They were still visible. It wasn't like you were hiding them. What was that for?" And he said that he had heard an airplane that was flying overhead, and it was actually red and white, and he thought it was a police airplane, so he didn't want to be seen and thought that if he could move them to the ledge, they would be less visible from the sky. It was actually confirmed that it was a plane that flew over this area at this exact time. However, it wasn't, of course, a police airplane, but there was a plane that he could have heard. And this wasn't a one-time confession where he was tired. We hear a lot about those confessions where, oh, they just said it because they were being interrogated for too long. However, he confessed several different times and even reenacted the crimes at the crime scene for investigators. He even said he kept twine in his pocket to entertain his children. And he said that day Francis ran after him and began to hit him over the head with the camera. And so he turned to her and started hitting her with a tree branch, and then went after the other two women so they couldn't identify him. And Chester also said he positioned their bodies to look like they were assaulted sexually, to look like it was some sort of sex fiend and not someone who just attacked them like he did. However, all of this would change because Chester would get a meeting with an attorney and change his story to the detectives forced him to confess, and that wasn't true. Chester said they threatened him with a gun, and he was actually in Old Gillespie at the time of the killings. The trial began January 20th, 1961 for only one of the women because they feared that if he didn't get the right charge, the right verdict, they wouldn't be able to try him for the other two women, so they were going to do it separately. However, March 4th, Chester Weger was found guilty, but only sentenced to life in prison rather than the death penalty, which they were going for at first. And the jurors didn't know that in Illinois, a life sentence really doesn't mean a life sentence. They would get parole in a few years. And so the jurors were asked, after knowing that in Illinois you wouldn't get actually a full life sentence, they were asked, would you have voted for the death penalty if you would have known that? And most of them said yes. Chester, however, has been denied parole many times and is still in prison today at the Illinois River Correctional Center. But many believe he has been wrongfully imprisoned for all of these years because in 1982, a Chicago police sergeant was called to a hospital where there was a terminally ill patient who was dying and wanted to get something off her chest. And she said that years prior, when she was younger, her and some friends had gone to a state park and they had done something horrible. She said this was in Utica and things got out of hand and there were multiple victims and they had dragged their bodies. This woman was confessing all of this when her daughters actually ran in, stopped the interview, told her that she was crazy, and basically the officer didn't get any more information from her because the daughters wouldn't let her speak. Now, this confession was submitted years later, which doesn't make sense to me, but it was 2006 before anyone even heard about this. And it was submitted to get more tests of the DNA, and it was actually found that there was DNA at the scene that they had collected. However, it had been untestable after so many years of not being preserved correctly. But was Chester innocent? Now, with this one, it really is confusing to me because other than the part about the airplane and him saying that and there actually was an airplane, nothing about his confession or the evidence against him made me say, yes, he is guilty. I truly believe he is guilty. There just wasn't a ton against him. I mean, yes, there was a lot of confessions, a lot of failed polygraph tests, but those again also have to do with the police. And I don't want to say that the police did anything bad in this case because they really seem to be on top of it, other than the fact that they were fighting about it. But it could be fixed if all the evidence against him does have to do with police. I mean, he was quite a small man to attack 3 women, although they were a little bit older, but it's not like that they were super old and couldn't move. They were on a hike in the winter. They obviously could move around quite well, and he was saying that one of them attacked him, so they obviously would have fought back. So could 3 women have been subdued by one small male? And I really hate that more wasn't looked into this deathbed confession because I think that those are the most honest confessions because most people do want to confess their sins before they pass. And it just seems like this is something that could have been huge in this case. I mean, maybe those kids were at the lodge and that's how everything came to be with the lodge as well. Maybe the kids that this deathbed confession was about were also at the lodge, saw these women, but I also think it could have been the lodge's employees. Maybe there were several of them working together because it's weird that there was so much stuff in their rooms and that the postcard was gone, like somebody was watching them from inside the rooms or from inside the hotel. But I do want to thank the Morbid podcast for a lot of information in this case. In fact, most of it. Of course, with cases that are so far in the past, it takes a ton of time and research, which they did a wonderful job at doing because there isn't a lot on this case online. So I do want to thank them for that information. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about all this because I had never even heard about this case, and it came up on one of the sites that I was researching another case on, and I knew I had to tell you guys about it. But it's baffling. Do you think that Chester is guilty or innocent? I really have no idea, but it's not a definite to me in one way or another. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.